Right now you should be seeing a slide that says solar for faith facilities. And so just a little bit of background. GreenFaith, the interfaith environmental group that I direct, we've had a pretty long-standing commitment since the early 2000s to finding solar opportunities for faith-based groups. We've successfully installed more than 1 megawatt worth of solar capacity on faith facilities and on the households of faith members of faith communities. And we've been able to work with a variety of partners to take advantage of state or utility rebates, different forms of public and private financing. And then we've also worked alongside a couple of congregations that have privately financed the solar array themselves. So we've seen a number of different ways that solar happens. And just to give you a sense of the costs involved in a solar project, that you've got the obvious costs, which are the materials, the solar panels. Another piece of equipment that it's important to be aware of is called an inverter, which is the machinery that turns the direct current or DC electricity that comes off of the solar panels into AC power that can be used in households and in institutions in the United States. So there's an equipment cost with that. And there's costs related to the wiring materials. Then there are obviously labor costs, both the permitting, which takes some time, whatever entity is getting the solar project installed, you have to get it permitted. Usually almost always with the local building inspector. And then there's labor related to the installation. There are some costs related to insurance. I'll talk about that in a little bit. That's not very much, but it is a small piece of the picture. And then maintenance, thankfully, with solar on a week-to-week basis is minimal to non-existent. The biggest maintenance cost is if, God forbid, you have a major storm and a huge tree branch falls on the solar array and cracks some of the panels, then obviously the panels have to be replaced. The inverters have a lifetime of if you're unlucky, 10 years, if you're fortunate, even up to 20. Most of them are warranted for at least 15 years now. So that's a sort of once in a lifetime of the solar array occurrence to have to replace an inverter. And those are really, the maintenance, you don't need to shovel or, you don't need to shovel snow off the panels. You don't need to brush them off or squeegee them or wash them or anything like that. They pretty much take care of themselves in that kind of way. And this figure down at the bottom of the $5 per watt of installed capacity, I'll say a little bit more about that later on. So that's a little bit about the finances of how solar works. And so that's the expense side. On the income side, solar arrays generate income in a variety of different ways. And this becomes important in terms of understanding the different kinds of financing options that I'm going to talk about. So obviously, in terms of income or economic value, solar arrays produce electricity. And that electricity has value. It has value if a third-party solar provider is generating it and then charging you a discounted rate for that electricity. That has value. If you own the system outright and the system's generating electricity, that electricity has value. So that's pretty obvious. Then there are three non-material but meaningful financial values to solar in a growing number of states, but not everywhere. For every kilowatt hour of solar electricity that panels generate, there is a credit called a solar renewable energy credit that is generated. And in states that have that system, those credits have an economic value and they can be sold. There is a federal tax credit for solar. And the solar industry is deeply, deeply dependent on federal and state regulation and policy. And so that's not a small thing, because the federal tax credit is a 30% tax credit for the value of the solar array. So just to use a round number, if an institution spends $10,000 installing a solar array, $3,000 of that, or 30%, can be taken as a tax credit. We'll talk more about that in relationship to religious institutions, which obviously are not taxable, and which don't pay taxes in that kind of way. And then there's also depreciation value. The longer a solar array exists, the more depreciation value that for-profit entities can recognize on their tax returns. And I know that a number of these things don't sound like they apply to religious institutions, but I'll explain why they do in a moment. So how does solar happen at faith facilities? I think it's really important to recognize that in just about every case, some kind of financing is needed. And I think it's really important to say that at this stage, we are not seeing anywhere situations where, excuse me, foundations or state governments are making grants to cover the cost of a solar array. They may be out there, but we haven't seen it. And we don't think, we would not advise religious institutions to base their solar plans on acquiring grants to cover the cost of the installation, because we just don't see that happening. That said, there are a small but growing number of public-private financing vehicles that make use of some form of state government rebate or subsidy along with the federal tax credit that I mentioned. One of the more common ones of common agreements like that is called a power purchase agreement, and I'm going to go into that in some detail. There are, in a small number of cases, and to be honest, this approach only works in situations where there are a reasonable number of fairly wealthy members of a congregation, where a number of members of a congregation can privately finance a solar array for a house of worship, and can and I'll describe how that works. They form a limited liability corporation, and they're able to make the finances work in that way. There is a concept called community solar, which is great in theory, but so far has been very, very difficult to make happen in practice at any meaningful scale. And then there's the donation approach. I mean, sometimes faith communities, I spoke with one church just last week that was getting a solar array donated by a member of the congregation, which is a very sizable donation. So those are a number of the ways in which the solar can happen. I'm going to now go up because I've seen a couple of hands go up. If folks, what I would suggest is that instead of raising hands, it would be better if folks could enter their questions into the chat box or into the Q&A box, just because that's going to be easier. I want to make sure that we capture all of the questions so that we can include that in the recording that's left. So I do see the hands that have gone up, but if it's possible for folks to type their answers, their questions in, that would be absolutely super. So Brooks, let me pause for a sec, because I know this is a ton of info. Is this seeming on target so far?
Yeah, I think you're doing great. Just keep going.
All right, super. I just want to. It's a little bit of it's sort of a little bit like drinking from a fire hose sometimes. But okay, so I'm going to go back to the slides and pick up again. Hang on just a sec. Okay, so public-private financing. So this is where almost inevitably there is some form of public-private hybrid financing that happens with a a large majority of solar installations that happen on faith-based facilities. In the past, this used to happen, and it still does happen in some states where solar financing or the state is promoting solar installations for the first time. In some states, the state will set aside a certain amount of money that it will very simply use as a rebate to buy down the cost of a solar installation for different partners. And the way that we've seen it happen in most of the states that take that approach is that understandably those rebate funds are pretty hot commodities. Usually there is a process through which a congregation will partner with a solar developer. They will submit an application for the rebate, and you essentially then stand in line digitally and wait for often a period of anywhere from 3 to 12 months to hear about whether you will actually get that rebate or not. And if you get the rebate, then very often the solar developer will finance the remainder of the system cost, and the congregation will be able to pay back the cost, the outstanding cost of the system over time, usually based on a value that's equal to or a little bit less than the value of the electricity that the panels generate on a monthly basis, so that you're in a position where you can be cash flow positive right from the start. So that's one approach, the rebate approach. The other approach that we've seen in more mature solar markets usually is that either a state or a utility will establish a market for the sale of renewable energy credits. And essentially what that means, I mentioned the renewable energy credits a few minutes ago. Essentially what that means is that for every kilowatt hour of electricity that your solar array generates, you can sell that. And it's usually pretty easy to make those sales. Usually you get an electronic certificate. There's an online sort of sales brokerage services that manage those markets. So it's not technically difficult to make those sales. And that becomes a source of income or a source of funding. I'm going to talk about how those renewable energy credits get used in the power purchase agreement model in just a moment. If a congregation decides that it wants to finance a solar array itself in a state where there are these renewable energy credits, then essentially what the congregation would do is it would either borrow or invest its own money to fund the installation of the system, and then the congregation would simply sell its renewable energy credits and get the income that those generate. That's not the situation that we normally recommend, and in most cases it's not possible because solar arrays are not inexpensive. So those are either the rebate model or the sale of renewable energy credit model are the two primary ways that we've seen public financing enter into the picture. And the second one, the renewable energy credit sale, is obviously an explicitly market-based model. All right, so take a deep breath, because this is the tricky part now about what are called power purchase agreements. And these are the kinds of agreements which are complicated, but which for a number of reasons we've seen be the most common kind of approach for religious institutions. So what's a power purchase agreement? So with a solar array, as I said, there is a meaningful federal tax credit that goes to the owner of the solar array. However, faith-based institutions, because they are nonprofit, cannot use these credits. So a faith-based institution can get a 30% tax credit on a solar array, but it can't make use of it because it pays no federal taxes. In almost every case, these credits have to be realized, the tax credit has to be realized for the project to be economically feasible. Again, if you're in a donation situation, that's a little bit different. But for the most part, I think it's smart to assume that for a faith-based institution, you're going to want to figure out some kind of way to make use of the tax credit. So in a power purchase agreement, the way it works is that a private investor finances and installs and actually owns the solar array that's up on the church or synagogue or mosque roof. And that church or synagogue or mosque then purchases the electricity generated by the solar array from the private owner. And usually that purchase price is set at a meaningful discount level to what the house of worship would pay itself if it were paying electricity cost to the utility. In these situations, the owner, the private owner, almost always retains ownership of the renewable energy credits that I mentioned and is able to sell those. And very often in these power purchase agreements, after the 5th or 6th or 7th year, the contract includes an option to purchase for the house of worship or for the host site after the 5th or 6th or 7th year. And the reason for that is the depreciation piece that I mentioned earlier. Excuse me, that depreciation usually after 5, 6, or 7 years, all of the depreciation related value has been taken out of the solar array on the owner's tax returns. And so at that point, for a private owner who's doing this work from an investment perspective, what they want to do is they want to try to get their money back, invest in another solar array that's new so they can get the benefit of that depreciation value for the first 5 years. So that's a quick intro, and I'm going to go through a sort of a typical solar PPA or power purchase agreement opportunity. So from what we've seen, a typical opportunity comes first, this no-cost installation. So that's one of the things that's typical of most PPAs, and it's a really nice dimension. A house of worship doesn't have to put up anything to have the array installed. Often, the length of the agreement, we've seen anywhere from 15 years to 25 years. I put 20 here because that's a pretty common length that we've seen, but we've seen anywhere from 15 to 25 years. I just mentioned the buyout option after year 5. Now, one of the things that is really important to think about in terms of PPAs, and this is hard, is that because the array is going to be up on the roof for 15 or 20 or 25 years, the investor wants to know that you've got a roof that's in very good condition. The reason for that is that if you need to do a roof replacement during the length of the agreement, the owner of the array is not going to be willing to pay, in almost every case, is not going to be willing to pay to come out and remove the solar array from your roof so that you can then do the roof replacement and then come put that back up. Because that's a costly process. And we recommend that congregations, if you're in a PPA, you need to have a fairly new roof, because otherwise that cost to you of taking the array off and putting it back on is going to eat up an awful lot of your savings. And it's going to become a real sort of economic challenge to make that happen. So that's something to keep in mind. And many solar developers that do PPAs will not do a roof if it's over 10 years of age. So that's something to be aware of, and that's an important factor. Now, another important factor is that most PPA solar developers are looking to do what for religious institutions are pretty large systems. They're looking, sometimes we can find installers who are willing to go as low as 50 kilowatts as a system. Very often they're looking for systems that are 100 kilowatts or larger. And the average size of a solar array that we've had on a religious institution in our experience is, I think, 31 kW. And that this shouldn't say suitable for a vast majority of congregations, it's unsuitable for a vast majority. It's one thing if you've got a large congregation, It's one thing if you've got a faith-based school or a large, large physical plant, a large, gymnasium or something like that. Then you're likely to have a roof that'll get into that 50 kilowatt plus size range. But in an awful lot of cases, this threshold is higher than the average house of worship has. And we've negotiated and tried to push, more than 15 solar developers to bend and to come down to 20 or 30 kW as a system size. And all I can say is that it's just really, really difficult to get them to do that. I do think that in a number of cases in the next 5 to 10 years, there will be solar developers that will start to look at that segment of the market because it's underserved nationally. And I also think that what's happening is that the first roofs that most solar developers want to do are the really big, big box store warehouse type roofs, because those are, they're just big, big systems, and that's understandable. But I do think there will come a time when there will be better options for religious institutions with this. Another characteristic of a typical PPA opportunity is that normally you start in the first year paying a certain fixed rate for electricity. Often, not always, there is an escalator year to year in the cost of electricity that you pay if you're the host site to purchase the electricity. It's just important to be aware of what is that escalator. We've normally seen something in the 2 to 3% range, but it's important if you're doing a PPA to take a look at that. And then the final piece is insurance, roof warranty, and repairs. Usually what we have seen is that congregations elect to pay a couple of $100 extra per year to have some additional insurance on their facility to cover the cost of any damage to the array that is not covered by the solar developer. That's, again, something that differs from contract to contract and has to be just examined every time you do an agreement on these. Solar developers absolutely should make sure and should get in writing that their solar installation does not void any warranty that you have on your roof. And if they're not willing to do that, you should go find a different solar developer. Because, in most cases, there are not problems, but there absolutely can be problems if workmanship is not done well. And the developer absolutely ought to get in writing from roof company, from your roofing system or roofing company, that the solar installation is not going to void the warranty. And then there should be an agreement about repairs. And essentially what we tell congregations, and this is the case in most situations, that if there are any repairs required to the system, that should be 100% the responsibility of the solar developer or the owner of the system. So I see there are some questions, so I'm going to shift to the chat function here, or try to shift to the, I'm going to come back, hang on a sec, I'll come back off of this, and let me go to the chat function and see what we've got in terms of some questions. Okay, so going back up to the top. So there's one question about a specific solar developer. And to be completely frank, what I would prefer to do, because we've had dealings with a certain number of them, is not to make comments on this webinar about specific solar developers, just because I don't think that's appropriate. If folks want to email me, I'd be very glad to share whatever perspectives we've got. And also, solar developers are evolving in the way in which they structure their offers. So our experience with them, 12, 18, 24, 36 months ago might not be relevant now. But what I would say is on that, email me if you have questions about a specific solar developer. In many cases, I won't know them, but in some cases we might. We've got a second question from the Cornerstone Fund. Brooks, is the Cornerstone Fund a UCC affiliated fund?
Yes, it's a UCC affiliated fund. It's not part of our national setting per se, but it's a separate entity, but we work with them, and they're a great institution to work with.
Great. So we've got Maria Coyne, who's the president and CEO of the Cornerstone Fund, on the webinar. And what might make sense would be, Brooks, if you would like, you could send out info to your list about the Cornerstone Fund and its options, if you would like. I don't mean to put anybody in the spot unnecessarily, but I just wanted to mention that we got a nice question from Maria. Okay, so another question. I would love to get a list of our participants. Perhaps we can connect and help each other. That's in, Brooks, that's in your court. I can share with you the registration list, and GreenFaith's data sharing policy is that we're not allowed without permission to share folks' info. But Brooks, I can give you the list because we have an agreement together, and you can identify the UCC folks on that and reach out to them if that's something that you'd like to do. Next, when you said there's virtually no cleaning of panel requires, okay, so we've got one person who's sharing that they do have solar panels at their home, and when there's snow that sticks or freezes, they do have to sweep the snow off, or little to no electricity is produced. That's true. What we have been told very consistently, particularly by solar developers, is that if you don't own the system, the owner of the system does not generally want people cleaning off or having contact with the system. They prefer to manage that themselves if that contact is going to happen. So that's the reason that we've said that, because that's that the vast majority of cases that we're aware of are fall into that category. What we always say to folks is that some solar arrays are mounted in parking lots or on the ground, but most of them are up on the roof. And just, if you're going to go up on the roof and do any kind of work yourself around the panels, be extraordinarily careful, and unless you have a licensed electrician doing the work, absolutely do not do anything with the wiring. It just is, it's just not safe. So next question, we have a quote from one system, and considering whether to take it requires us to raise about $100,000 to install the system. This is, in terms of deciding whether to raise funds, do a fundraising campaign. I think that's very much a case-by-case decision for congregations. I pastored in a local church, or in local churches, for 10 years. I know that the amount of money that congregations can raise for capital projects is limited, and you just have to make a smart strategic choice about the various benefits and costs of investing your capital fundraising efforts in any particular direction. And that's not just true of solar. We generally are big fans of trying to finance solar through a third party, because we think increasingly that money is out there. Very often you could, and again, there's such variation state to state. I mean, New Jersey, where we're located, has done a lot of solar work, and so banks in New Jersey are willing to lend at pretty reasonable rates towards solar array and solar installations. But in other parts of the country where solar is not as common, local bankers will not have that comfort level because they just haven't seen the projects happen. So it varies from place to place. Question: how long are the systems projected to last? Most solar, the solar panels, in most cases that we see nowadays, the panels themselves are usually warranted either 20 or 25 years. And it's not at all uncommon to expect, or unwise to expect, that you get 30 years out of the solar panels. You would need to change out the inverters during that time, as I mentioned previously. But I think that it is likely within that period of time that new technology is likely to emerge within those next couple of decades. And so I think what if you've got solar, it's just as likely that instead of seeing the end of the natural life of your system, you may well want to upgrade to the newest technology. And then last question is any recommendations for solar developers in Southern California? And again, if folks can email me offline, I'll share what I'm able to share on that. And Then another question, what's the cost per kilowatt hour of solar versus fossil fuel-based systems? Again, that depends. There is a pretty wide range of costs for electricity in different states across the country. So here in the New York, New Jersey area, we see religious customers paying anywhere between 16 and 22 cents per kilowatt hour. In Kentucky, because of the strength of the coal industry on multiple levels, you see costs that are half of that. So there really is a really wide variation of cost to the consumer in terms of electricity generated in different ways. I think that all of the environmental economists that I'm aware of are very much on the same page, that they say if you do if you count the social cost of carbon emissions in terms of environmental and health damage, that means that wind power and solar are more than competitive with fossil fuels and actually are meaningfully less expensive. But of course, the markets don't currently factor in that calculation. All right, thanks everybody for all these questions. I'll keep on coming back to them, but I'll go back and do a screen share now, again, to get through a few more slides. And again, my apologies for the sort of super fast talking thing, but it's just, so let's talk for just a little bit about how I'll go through again. I know there's some repetition here, but I found with this stuff it's helpful. So the way in which, if you're doing a power purchase agreement, you are billed for the actual amount of electricity that is produced by your system. And that's the norm. And so if you have a solar array on your congregation and your monthly electric bill is 350 kilowatt hours, and your solar array generates 200 of that, then you will pay the solar developer for those 200 kilowatts at whatever price you agree on for the solar electricity. And then you will pay your utility its standard rate for the 150 kilowatts that you purchase from the utility. Now, in a very small number of cases, some power purchase agreements are written so that they say, okay, here is the potential solar production or the expected average annual solar production for a solar array in a given year based on historical sunlight and clouding data. And some solar developers will charge that annual average amount regardless of what the weather is in any given year. And the theory behind that is they want to smooth out their cash flows. They want to be able to have a predictable amount of cash flow year to year. In almost every situation that we're aware of, the variation from year to year is you'll either go 10% above or 10% below the ongoing average. So unless you've got a really large facility, there's not a huge variation that way. Our preference is for the amount of electricity that you actually purchase. That's what you want to do, not for the potential or projected amount. Permitting fees, in most cases, we've seen the solar developer, solar installer cover 100% of those costs. We've seen a small number of cases where some solar developers will say, we will be responsible up for this amount of permitting cost, and after that, the host site is responsible. Our strong recommendation with that is make sure that the solar developer is responsible for all of the permitting fees. Usually it's not, you do run into a situation if you've got a historic building or if you've got a building in a historic district, that can become more complicated. I should have said earlier that for any churches, older churches that have slate roofs, slate is not good for solar. When you drill through it to attach the solar array to the roof, the slate shatters. And so unfortunately, if you've got a slate roof, we've not seen very many solar installers that are willing to take that on, and we generally recommend against that. So I'll check this one question and then go, well, actually, let me go through the process here a little bit. So if you actually go through this kind of process, and this is true whether it's a power purchase agreement or other types of financing agreements, or even if you're going to purchase this outright, the solar developer will normally want to go through an intake process where they get your contact information. They're going to want to get information about the basic condition of your roof. That may mean you'll need to provide them with the age of the roof. It may mean age plus photos. Usually they'll want to get at least that amount of information from you before they come out to do a site visit. And then nowadays what solar developers do is that they will look at your roof via satellite photo to assess the level of shading that you've got on your roof, because that has a very significant impact on the amount of solar production that's possible. And in many states that have some form of renewable energy credit process or some sort of rebate process, the state will require that a site that gets a rebate or an incentive does not have more than a certain percentage of shading. And all of the solar developers will know those figures for the state that you're in. But just to be aware that can be an issue. Again, especially older congregations, you've got beautiful older trees around the house of worship. Unfortunately, that can become an issue. So anyway, there's an intake process where you're going to be sharing some basic information. And the goal of that intake process from the perspective of the solar developer is to figure out, is this roof viable, basically? Does it look like this is going to be possible? And if it does look like it's going to be possible, then they go to the next step, which is actually to rough up a design of what your system would look like. For that, the solar developer is going to want to have 12 months of your electricity bills. And they will, based on that information, plus the satellite photos, plus the satellite photos, they'll pull together a preliminary proposal. And that preliminary proposal will have the size of the system, the expected amount of electricity that it will produce. They will make assumptions about the cost of electricity and how that cost will escalate over time. And based on all of that information, they'll calculate 1-year savings and 20-year savings based on that. So you will get, a reasonable estimate of sort of what that, what the system would look like, how big it would be, what it would produce, and what its economic benefits would be to your institution. And if that preliminary proposal looks good, very often what solar developers do at that point is they ask you to sign a letter of intent, which is in most cases non-binding. So you sign the letter of intent, not saying you have to proceed with the project, but saying that that you're not going to go shopping around to others at that point in time. That and it's a way of trying to start to get the process more serious in terms of and giving them a sense that they can then that you're serious enough that they will then invest some further engineering resources to get the system sort of fine-tuned for your setting. Once that letter of intent is signed, at that point, if it hasn't happened already, you will get a site visit. An engineering team will come out. There'll be a contract drawn up, and the engineering team will try to get much more specific about the exact size of the system. There will always be a little bit of room for adjustment in the size of the system, because once the installation starts, you never know what you're going to find. I mean, usually there aren't any unexpected surprises if the company has done a good engineering inspection beforehand, but you never know. So there's sometimes just a little bit of adjustment. But you'll go through, once that letter of intent is signed, a contracting process, an engineering and permitting process, and then once the system is permitted, it'll get installed. And then there's a commissioning, which is when the switch gets flipped and the system becomes operational. So that's and then I guess I should have put step 3, which happens obviously before the system's actually installed. Once you've got a proposal, The solar firm ought to make itself available to respond to your questions. We have seen that solar developers are willing to come out and do a presentation to a church council or a leadership committee at a congregation, and they also are willing and glad to do sort of connecting by phone. To be honest, there is a meaningful difference between solar companies in terms of their level of customer service. Some are quite good at it, others are not very good. And, that just is what it is. And my sense is that you'll get a sense pretty quickly of what you're dealing with when you are, once you get to the letter of intent stage. A lot of solar developers will not want to put too much time into a project until they've got a letter of intent, because it's costly for them to invest the engineering time and resources. But once you get that letter of intent, you ought to get a decent level of attention, because you should. It's an important project. So, running out of breath. So let me go back. Before we go to questions, I see we've got 2 questions. So a while back, I mentioned sort of right at the beginning, the options of private financing by members of a congregation and something called community solar. So I want to spend just a couple of minutes talking about those. So private financing, the way that by congregation members, the way that works, and we've seen this happen in a handful of cases, is that, 4 or 5 or 6 or 8 or 10 members of a congregation will decide that they want to finance a solar array for their congregation. And they do it because they like the idea of helping the congregation become more greener. They like they're not in a position, or they may not be in a position, to make an outright donation, but they realize that they're able to structure an agreement in a manner that meets their financial needs and that's also beneficial to the congregation. And so what happens in those cases is that this group of congregation members forms a limited liability corporation, and they essentially work with the church or congregation to identify the solar developer, to get the proposal, to understand the cost of the system. The limited liability corporation then will usually pay for the installation of the system up front, and the church will repay, or will pay, the church will agree to pay the limited liability corporation a certain fee on a monthly basis. Sometimes it's the retail cost of the electricity. Sometimes it's a significantly discounted cost for the electricity that's generated. Again, those details need to get worked out between congregation members, between the leadership of the congregation and the LLC. And then very often what we've seen is that the LLC, after a certain number of years, will either donate the system to the congregation, or will make a provision for a very generous, inexpensive buyout provision, which they're able to do in a certain number of ways. This sort of limited liability corporation approach, it doesn't work. We've never seen it work, and I believe, and I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know for sure, but I believe that there may be limitations on how many people can be part of a limited liability corporation. So some people say, well, couldn't we get everybody in the congregation to pitch in? And there are both practical, and I believe there may be some legal issues that need to be addressed in terms of creating the LLC. And essentially, as with any shared enterprise like that, the more parties that are involved, the more complex it becomes. So when we've seen this LLC approach work, it's usually been 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 people who know each other pretty well, where the trust level is high, and they're able to go through the process. And somewhere in our files, we have some sample legal documents that we got from one congregation that took this approach. And if anybody's interested in those, we have their permission to to share that. We obviously can't vouch for their suitability in any given situation, but it could give you a sense of what that kind of document could look like. So that's the private financing by congregation members or a third-party LLC. The other kind of approach that gets talked about increasingly is called community solar. The way that community solar works is that in community solar, let's say you live in a house or you have your congregation wants to use solar electricity, but does not have a roof that's suitable for it for any number of reasons. And what community solar is a mechanism by which customers in a given area, closely united geographically, reasonably closely united geographically, decide together that they want to make a commitment to purchase their electricity from a community solar farm over an extended period of time. And what and so community solar, that's essentially the community solar concept. It sounds wonderful in theory. What we've seen in practice is that it is challenging to make it work. There are a lot of legal complexities involved, and it also is much harder than you might think in many places to get enough people to sign up that they're committed to buying their electricity from the community solar project. It's just not easy to make those projects work. I heard just a couple of weeks ago that there may be some success in Massachusetts recently. I haven't had time to look into that yet. And so things may be changing that I'm not aware of. But just a word of caution around that. In our experience, it's not been easy to make those community solar kind of projects work. So Brooks has put some info up in the chat box about the Cornerstone Fund and the UCC Church Building and Loan Fund, where Patrick Dugan is in charge, who does a super job with that. So thanks, Brooks, for putting that up there. One question came in about what about an installation over parking lots, which avoids concerns about a roof. There are solar developers that will do parking lot ground-mounted systems. They are costlier for the solar developer, and so it's just so it's sometimes harder to find a developer who will do that. But we have seen them done. I've seen, frankly, more of those projects done in public school-related contexts than I have in house of worship contexts. But it is possible, and it's usually a question of what the interest and experience level of any solar developer that you're working with or solar installer that you're working with might have. And then thanks to John Pitney, who'd put in that Oregon has community solar coordinated at the state level. So I'll be eager to learn more about that. Gosh, I'm sorry to have talked so much. It's kind of wall-to-wall yakking, but Brooks, those are the questions that I've seen in the chat box and in the Q&A function. Any questions that you'd like to raise up, or any points that ought to get clarified a little bit?
No. I think you've been pretty thorough in covering a lot. I may have missed it while I was looking up that website, but did you talk about what PACE financing means?
Yep. So do you want to explain that? I know a little bit.
I'm not an expert on that, so I'll defer to you. So
PACE, if I remember correctly, stands for Property Assessed Clean Energy. And it is a financing program, a renewable energy financing program that can get implemented at a state-by-state level to try to provide more channels or mechanisms for financing to be available to support the installation of renewable energy projects. And I don't think that PACE does energy efficiency, but I could be wrong on that. The PACE programs are at sort of different maturity levels in different states, and not every state, to my knowledge, has a PACE program that's active. But it's another thing to Google in terms of you're looking for other financing options in your state. You could do a Google for PACE, PACE. Just if you do PACE clean energy financing, you'll probably get results that way. Good. And then we've got from one panelist saying, I can't see Brooks's information. Oh, you know what? Brooks sent. What I'm going to do is I'm going to forward Brooks's information to all attendees, because by mistake Brooks did what I do all the time, which is he put the information just to him and me. So I'll post that in. All right, there. So I just put the UCC Church Building and Loan Fund and the Cornerstone Fund websites up there for everybody. And I see one more question came in. Where's the info on the Cornerstone Fund? Just put that up. Brooks, do you want to? We're at the top of the hour. Do you want to close us out? Any closing thoughts?
I just asked one more question, which is, I've seen just Googling that there appear to be some zero down loans out there. How common are zero down loans for financing solar? And
I mean, in a certain way, not completely, but they're out there. Again, it really depends solar market by solar market. So much of what drives the solar market is so much of the solar market is dependent on state policies. And so if you've got good state policies, then it can be, then you get more financing options that are out there. If you get, if you have state policies that are lukewarm or not so good, then the financing options are not so, are not so common. So, if folks have any particular question about anything, shoot me an email and I'd be glad to take a quick look, and if I can make any sense of it, share that. And we got one question that came in saying there are funding contractors who work with churches and provide the service of organizing the LLC, do the whole complicated process, receiving all the benefits. As you said, the system becomes the church's in 6 years. Comment on these contractors. Again, I'm not in a position to comment on any individual contractor, so it's a case-by-case basis. I think, the biggest question about the LLC approach is, as a church or as a house of worship, one question is you have to decide, do you want to, the people who will be investing in the LLC will most likely be some of your wealthiest members. And so you have to ask yourself, do you want to, I'm a pastor, so the way I ask myself is, do I want their investment going in that particular direction? If the answer is yes, then I think it's absolutely worth looking at. I would absolutely be sure before doing solar that you really tighten up the efficiency side of the equation, because that can often make it possible to do a smaller and therefore less expensive solar array. And the UCC Church Building and Loan Fund, I know, does really good work that way. So the LLCs can work, but as I said, these projects are all a relatively high degree of difficulty. And in terms of a question about historic district siting, again, it's sort of case by case. The less visible, we've seen solar arrays work in historic districts when the solar array is not facing the main street, but rather is much less visible to the public. So I think those are the kinds of considerations that we see. And usually I think the best thing to do is try to get a representative of the historic district to come, bring them into the conversation early on and tell them what you're hoping to do, and see if it's possible to develop a good working relationship with them to figure out how to make the project work. So good. I think we're good.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Fletcher. And I just want to take, as we close, to take a step back. I realize we've been diving in really deep into financial language and a lot of things that are really important and really necessary for us to learn about. But I also want to acknowledge that we've got everybody on here who has come to this call because they're grounded and rooted in their faith, and because they realize how important it is that we be caretakers of creation, and how blessed we are to have the gift of the sun and to have this wonderful world that we inhabit. And so I just want to acknowledge that what we're rooted in and what we're grounded in as we do this important work, because I think ultimately that's what sustains us in learning about these things. That for me, a person who's not a financial person, okay, I'll stick with this because this is important, and this is about my faith. And so thank you so much to everybody for joining us, and we'll have an email go out, as Fletcher mentioned, to you can watch this video and share this video with others. And so thank you very much, Fletcher, for joining us.
Good to be with you. Thanks for the invitation. Thanks everybody, and we'll talk again soon. Take good care.
Right. Yeah. Thank you.
Bye-bye.